Please, you must believe me. I did not do this.
He's lying! This is all your fault!
We have nothing left to eat!
Please, calm down, everyone.
If you punish Ansel, you must punish me first.
Marta pushed the splintered latch and a gust of cold blew the doorway wider. The granary stood half, empty, and several sacks of flour were gone. Suspicion tightened her hands as she lifted the torn sack flap and found only a smear of pale snow and a damp footprint on the wooden floor. Thomas crouched and pressed his palm to the frost-dusted board. "Someone took from us," he said. The problem was immediate. Food missing, winter deepening, the village's stores now a question of who would sleep and who would go hungry. Marta folded her cloak tighter. She checked the ledger nailed by the door with a practiced eye, the place where Pastor Joan kept crude notes of contributions and withdrawals. The numbers were small and exact, and the missing sacks pushed them past a safe margin. Thomas leaned back against the post and spat. "We cannot feed more mouths tonight if this continues," he said. The first feeling pushed Marta forward. Suspicion towards strangers, neighbors, and anyone who moved after the curfew. That suspicion made her voice low and direct. "We need to tell the square," she said. They crossed the river road where the ice had been flattened by carts the week before. The river lay frozen and grey, a hard road now used for travel and trade, but the ice carried new marks. Runners scraped with deep grooves the odd boot print, and a carved notch on a small sled runner. Marta traced the notch with a gloved finger. It looked like a merchant's mark or a clan sign. "This is not random," she said. Thomas frowned. "Either it's organized, or someone is teaching thieves to be neat." At the frozen well, candles guttered in iron sconces and villagers clustered like birds in wind. Pastor Johann stood where the square flagpole cast a thin shadow. He kept his hands visible, palms open, and spoke with steady cadence. "We must keep calm," he said. Voices rose anyway. Anika accused Jacob's band of trading with passing traders. Jacob answered with a short laugh and named names that shifted blame back to hungry families upstream. The meeting bent and re-bent under questions and small accusations. The central problem was clear in every face. Dwindling harvests and missing grain would force someone to make a desperate choice. Marta felt a change in the square. Suspicion slid into quick anger when the word thief left a mouth. Pastor Joan moved between two men who glared, and his hands made a slow, stopping motion. "Listen to Marta," he said. "She and Thomas found the granary. We will sort this without tearing the village apart." His voice did not erase the tension. When the crowd broke, some left with clenched jaws and others with lowered eyes. Marta volunteered to organize a search upstream. She did not choose the role for pride. She chose it because the stove at home burned low and her children had eaten 2 small bowls of thin porridge the night before. She had a small iron key on a cord at her waist. She kept it the way one keeps a name. "Thomas, he would go with her. You know the ice better than most," he said. Marta answered with a short nod and already had a list in her head of places to check. Abandoned homesteads, the old mill, the carts with carved marks. They left before dawn. The light was thin and the sky held a fur of pale cloud. Wind pressed at their faces. The frozen river road offered sound in small, crisp things. The scrape of sled runners, the creak of wood packed with frost, the whisper of a scarf across skin. Marta moved carefully, keeping her feet flat, testing the ice at every step. She paused whenever a distant house showed its lamplight. Each window became a small claim to warmth. A line of abandoned carts stood like a ruined spine along the river road. Each cart bore different cargo scars, sacks patched, crates empty, iron hoops bent. Marta knelt and found a carved mark on one sled runner that matched the notch at the granary. She pressed her thumb to the carving and then to her lips. tasting the cold in the air like a metallic tang. They moved in a pattern, she whispered. Thomas checked footprints that led toward a cluster of homesteads, then narrowed his eyes at a shallow drag mark that curved away from the road. The pattern suggested not a lone thief, but a group operating with planning and care. They reached the isolated farmhouse at midday. The smoke line rose from the chimney, but thinned quickly in the frozen air. Marta knocked on the rough door and then stepped in when no answer came. The hearth was warm under the ash. Someone had left in a hurry. A shallow bowl still had broth scum. A child's scarf lay by the bed, its faded red now dulled by salt and frost. Marta folded it in both hands, and the fabric reacted with the heat of her palms. She felt a squeeze in her chest that was not fear yet, but an urgency that made her move faster. A child left behind or taken. Thomas. His voice contained a new edge. He did not raise his eyes from the floorboards. They followed fresh tracks away from the farmhouse and onto a secondary path that curved toward the old mill. The mill stood with one sail half, closed and park bench like broken boards. A sluice creaked when they approached, water frozen like a knife, half open and half closed. Near the sluice a group huddled under lanterns. Faces showed the mathematical exhaustion of people who had not slept well for weeks. The rag band shared a sack of flour between them. At their head was Jacob, who had the look of someone who had learned to negotiate hard goods with harder voices. Jacob looked up when Marta and Thomas drew near. "We did not want to be seen," he said. His tone was coarse and protected. He did not claim innocence, but he did not admit guilt either. Pastor Jones stepped forward from behind Marta. He had followed at a distance and now carried himself as the village's slow judge. "Jacob, Pastor Johann, these sacks belong to the granary." "Explain." Jacob set down the spoon he used to stir the shared dough and answered with a slow sentence. "We took from abandoned barns and traders who passed without help. We took what was left." The air tightened with words. Anika, who had come with Marta that afternoon to watch the two sides, put a small hand on a child's shoulder and said, "You stole from us. You left our children to count bowls." Her voice came out ragged. Argument began in quick, raw lines. "You had mouths to feed." "Jacob, so did we," Pastor Johann answered. "Then why take ours?" Anika snapped. "Because your granary sits full while my father sleeps with empty hands." "Jacob." That exchange turned the argument into a list of grievances, each line raw and short. The crowd, where there was one, supplied answers in the form of accusations and whispered histories. Marta felt a change in her chest. Suspicion, then anger, then a sudden cold fear when Anika started to cry. The suspicion that began the day now bent into dread that children might be taken or abandoned. Marta stepped forward. She had a small hidden ration, a half loaf wrapped in oilcloth and tied beneath her apron. She had kept it for the night when her children were hungry. She thought of the scarf at the farmhouse and of the broth bowl. She thought of her iron key and how often she had used it to open locked sheds. The feeling in her hands moved to a decision in her mouth. She held the wrapped loaf out without a speech. "Take it," she said to Jacob. "Take this so the child eats." Jacob stared and then took the loaf with hands that trembled. Jacob's band murmured, and one of his people, a woman with a blunt braid, stepped forward and placed a palm on the loaf. "We meant no child to go hungry," she said. The band's leader met Marta's eyes. For a long breath they regarded one another without speaking. Thomas moved to stand beside Marta, and Pastor Johann watched the exchange as if reading a small, fragile treaty beneath their breath. Marta's action broke the meeting. The tension shifted. The standoff eased into a negotiating rhythm. "We will set terms, Pastor Johann. We will share the oven tonight, but you must help watch the roats and return part of the flour when you can." Jacob nodded once. He was not softened. He was measured. "We will set watch," he said. "We take less now and return when we can." The terms were imperfect, and each face around the oven accepted the compromise with a slow calculation. That night, they congregated at the communal oven where embers glowed like small, contained suns. Snow fell outside in steady sheets. Marta felt the heat and the weight of what she had done. The crowd was quieter now. The argument had become a plan. Anika sat close to a child with the red scarf wrapped twice around the small neck. Pastor Johan outlined the watch roster in clipped sentences. Thomas, you and Marta take the first watch. Jacob, you take the second. Others share the third. No one travels alone at night. His voice left no space for bargaining. Marta's hands still smelled faintly of flour and smoke. She shared the loaf with the child by breaking it into small pieces. The child ate without speaking. Marta watched his small jaw work and thought of her own children's mouths. Her decision had shifted the shape of the village's night. What began as suspicion had become a bargaining tool and then a small truce held together by the smell of baking bread. Yet not all danger had vanished. At dusk, as they set watches, a distant shout told from upstream and the village turned toward the sound. It was a single voice calling that a sled had been seen beyond the next bend. Marta stood, every part of her alert. The watch roster made the night manageable, but the shout suggested someone else moved in the dark with flour or with intent. Doubt returned, from suspicion to fear, and she felt the old notch of worry in her chest. They moved in small groups along the river road to check the claimed sighting. The sled tracks led toward a ridge and then stopped abruptly. A child's shoe lay in the snow beside the tracks. Marta picked it up. It was too small for her own children and had a patched sole. Someone moved children and supplies together, she said. The discovery felt like an accusation turned factual. Cold tightened her fingers around the shoe. Thomas breathed a low curse and looked at the indentations in the snow that continued in a single line away from the sled. The midchap twist came at the old mill when they returned with the child's shoe. One of Jacob's band, a younger man named Eric, had a brother on the opposite side of the river who had died of exposure months before. But his brother's name was on barter lists for the trader who controlled the upstream route. The village learned that some of the stolen flour had been traded to a passing trader in exchange for news and shelter. That reveal shifted the blame pattern. The theft was not simple theft. It had become part of a fragile, secret economy where names and favors moved like coins. When Pastor Johan pressed Jacob on the trade, Jacob's jaw tightened. He named the trader. Rolf. The name landed like a stone. Marta had seen Rolf once at market, a man with broad shoulders and a list that included prices for children's cloth and salt. Jacob explained that the band had traded small sacks to Rolf for blankets and for a promise of food later. Pastor Johan's hands made a tight line across his chest. If there is trade across our loss, he said. We must decide whether to stop the trader or change our own terms. His sentence underscored a new problem. The theft touched merchants beyond the village and connected to someone who might exploit their hunger. That discovery changed how Marta moved. She no longer felt only suspicion toward individuals. Her fear widened to include the idea that hunger had become currency, and that outsiders used cold to buy bargaining power. She paced the oven area and spoke quietly to Thomas. If Rolf returns, he will not show mercy, she said. Thomas rubbed his jaw. Then we must be ready, he answered. The decision hardened in her hands into a practical plan. Set longer patrols near the market road, hide the eldest children in trusted homes, and mark routes with notches only those who knew could read. The next day they found the sled riders again at dawn near a line of abandoned houses. A quick confrontation followed where words were traded like blows. Thomas and Jacob argued over whether to take the trader by force. The argument became loud and fast. 3 rapid exchanges where each man named his reasons and ended with names attached like accusations. We cannot burn his carts. Jacob, we will lose more if we wait. Thomas answered, then we take his goods and barter them among us. Jacob shot back, you propose theft in the name of law. Thomas snapped the back and forth carried sharp edges. Marta stepped between them. She did not raise her voice. She placed her hand against the sled runner with the carved notch and said, "We will search his stores first. If he hides what belongs to us, we will bring witnesses." The line calmed when she spoke. Her voice had a rhythm that cut through the heat of the argument. She had been fueled first by suspicion, then by fear, and now by deliberate resolve. They found Rolf's small store under a curtain of ice by noon. He had left in a hurry. They found sacks hidden behind flour barrels and a ledger with names that confirmed trade. Marta read the ledger with Thomas leaning close. The handwriting listed exchanges, sacks for blankets, sacks for shelter for certain named families. The ledger contained a name Marta knew from the mill. The ledger acted like evidence and turned argument into legal matter within the village. Pastor Johann declared they would return the goods if possible and summon witnesses. The confrontation at Rolf's empty stall marked the chapter's climax. Confronting the traders, ledger shifted the moral frame. This was not a criminal gang simply stealing. It was a network that traded scarcity itself. Jacob admitted his men had sold a small portion, but he said he had kept children from starving that way in his own family. His words were blunt and human. "I did not want to see my sister die," he said. The statement changed how Marta and the others saw him. The village Sangha moderated into a calculation about whether to punish or to integrate his group into defensive plans. They chose the latter, hard and slow. After the ledger was found, Pastor Johann arranged a list of restitutions. Jacob and his people agreed to return what they could and to help guard the shipments that left the granary. Thomas and Marta insisted that watches be extended and that the oven be open to both sets of families. Annika, who had accused Jacob, sat with him at the oven while they drew the watch roster. She looked at him with a steady, measuring gaze and said, "If you keep watch, I will help bring up the children when you trade bread." Jacob nodded, and the gesture turned a personal loss into an agreed duty. The night after the confrontation, they gathered again at Marta's cottage hearth. The hearth was small, and the air carried the smell of wood smoke and boiled greens. They planned routes and set notches on sled runners with a knife, the marks to be read only by those who had belonged to the village their whole lives. Pastor Johann spoke of mercy and law with short, careful sentences. Annika handed Marta a thin list of names she had seen at the mill. They spoke low so the children sleeping on the floor would not stir. Marta wrapped her hands around a steaming mug and felt her knuckles loosen. The day's progression had changed her. Suspicion had nudged her into action, fear had sharpened her, and resolve had made her choose sacrifice. She thought of the child, a scarf folded on a shelf. She thought of the loaf she had given and of the ledger in her hands. The choices she had made had rearranged who would sleep warm and who would stand in watch under wind, scraped roofs. When the small truce was set, they tested it immediately. A quiet patrol returned at dawn with an extra sack of rye found hidden under an old cart. The sack was shared after quick counting and a promise recorded in Pastor Johann's ledger. Marta signed with a careful cross. The returned sack did not erase the cost of the days before, but it created a new rhythm of shared responsibility. In the final hour before sleep, Annika stood by Marta and said, "You should rest now." Marta looked toward the window where snow fell in clean, even strokes. Her hands ached from the day's work. Her children slept mouths soft and ready. She gave Annika a small nod. Pastor Johann closed the meeting by asking who would take the first watch. Marta and Thomas rose together. Their decision was practical, not poetic. They took watch because others must sleep. Outside, the village settled into a brittle silence. Inside, around Marta's hearth, they divided rations by measure and set the watch order in ink. Jacob left with 2 of his men to repair a broken runner and promised to bring back nets of salted fish if he could. Thomas and Marta stepped outside and the wind hit their faces. They walked out along the river road, boots scuffing snow, and began the first slow circuit of the night. Marta listened for the small, relevant sounds. A distant dog, the scrape of ice under a runner, the hollow knock of a loose shutter. She felt tired in a way that lodged in her shoulders. She felt the aftertaste of fear and the steadying pick of a decision kept. The village had not healed, but a plan had been born. Watch shifts, shared bread, a pledge to confront traders who sold away what the village needed. Marta tightened her scarf and felt the weight of the small iron key at her waist. She lifted her hand and knocked once at Pastor Jonas' cottage door on the return loop to confirm the list of names. The knock was a small, decisive sound that tied the chapter closed. When they returned to the oven and to their hearths, the watch roster was pinned to the post. The child with the red scarf slept by Anika's feet, and the loaf Marta had given was nearly gone. They had resolved this night's immediate conflict. Stolen sacks, a trader's ledger, and the fragile alliance formed at the communal oven. The last line of the night was not a promise to change the world. It was a practical action. They would meet at dawn to inventory the granary together and walk the river road in pairs. Marta's final movement was to write the first name on the watch list and pass the quill to Pastor Johan. She closed the cottage door, paused to breathe in the wood smoke, and then placed the key on the peg by the hearth. The peg held it like a small, agreed truth. Marta swung the oven, yard gate wide, and found the coffer slid forced open. Tokens scattered across frost, dusted stone, and the single loaf meant for the morning gone. Suspicion tightened her fingers around the gate iron before she could step in. She pulled her wool cap lower and leaned to read the token marks under the lamplight. The wooden box smelled faintly of ash and stale flour. The site linked to the granary last week, torn sacks, a smear of snow, Thomas pressing his palm to a damp footprint, and the memory sharpened the shape of the problem. Shared bread had been taken. That reality left no room for vague worry. Something had been taken from the whole village, and Marta's first motion was to call for Ansel. She found Ansel already braced by the oven, sleeves rolled, flour on his palms, and an answer like a challenge in his eyes. Ansel, Marta, the coffer. Someone opened it. Ansel's face went flat. He crouched, ran a thumb along the scattered tokens, and counted them aloud in a voice that did not want to betray panic. "Half the morning loaf there's gone," he said. "Half the town will wake hungry." His hands moved, quick and small, scooping the tokens into a worn cloth. Suspicion moved from Marta to him and around the yard like cold air. Villagers would notice missing bread faster than they would missing coats. Thomas stepped up from the lane, breath steaming, and stopped when he saw the torn lid. He tapped the coffer with a boot. Whoever did this knows the schedule. Thomas? They waited until the watch turned. Marta watched him. Thomas' voice held the blunt cadence of someone used to setting nets and making decisions. He did not accuse Ansel aloud, but his eyes tracked the oven door and the lane toward the river. The first emotional shift landed then. Suspicion tightened into anger among the bystanders, while Marta kept a small, cold calculation. She needed facts before fury. Jacob, the elder, arrived with a slow, deliberate step and a heavy reply already forming in his mouth. He set his palms flat on the oven rim, as if to feel the heat that had once steadied the village routine. "We must meet in the chapel, Jacob." Rationing again and watch shifts now, his voice carried the authority of someone who had seen winter scarcity before. Villagers clustered and muttered, the complaint rising like wind through the yard. Marta put a hand on Ansel's forearm. Her touch was small, measured. She did not want a quarrel at the oven. She wanted to know whether the theft had come from inside their circle. The meeting moved fast. In the stone chapel, Jacob set out the rules with plain words and the sound of a gavel, a wooden spoon laid on a bench. From dawn tomorrow. 2 watchmen by the ovens. Every stamped sack counts. Whoever breaks the rules will make repair for all. Faces folded into the thin light from a single candle. Ansel argued short, clipped lines that tried to split blame from his hands. "I mark every loaf," he said. "I keep the token list." Marta watched him speak and noted how his shoulders rose, the small lie in the way his fingers tightened on the cloth. The crowd pushed questions at him. Marta little. She listened and catalogued gestures. Ansel avoiding eye contact, Thomas leaning forward, Jacob's steady interruptions. Doubt slid into Marta like cold through layered wool. Had someone inside the ovens helped themselves, or had an outside thief grown clever? After the meeting, Marta followed the narrow lane toward the river with Lynn, the village child who often ran errands for her. Lynn's boots left small, round prints in the glaze of night frost. Marta pointed to a pair of tiny footprints that led off the lane and toward the riverbank. The prints were small enough for a child or a wary woman, the toes turned inward from the cold. Lynn crouched and put a mittened hand near the prints without touching. They were here after dawn, Lynn. I saw smoke by the collapsed shed. Marta's mouth pressed into a thin line. The second emotional shift moved, from doubt to a cold, focused resolve. She would follow the trail. They walked the riverbank under a pale, low sun. The ice near the river's edge showed a patch of thaw, a grayness among white, and Marta's eyes caught a shallow scoop where the edge had given way. Someone had taken care to hide a small hollow and cover it with snow. Lynn pointed at a corner where fibers stuck out from the melt. Marta cleared the snow with gloved fingers and found a damp sack, half-eaten loaves cradled inside, and a scrap of stamped cloth with a bakery mark. The discovery made Marta's hands tremble in a way that was not cold. She lifted a loaf and held it closer to smell, soreness of old yeast, a stitch of char on the crust. She thought of the coffer and the missing token. The facts pressed together and began to form a different shape. The theft was larger than a single hungry act. It was deliberate concealment. Marta and Lynn moved fast back toward the lane with the cash. The village felt smaller, the houses leaning closer with suspicion. On the way, Thomas met them with 2 lanterns and a clenched look. "You found something?" he asked. His voice showed eagerness, almost hunger for confirmation. Marta held out the bakery, stamped cloth. Thomas frowned. "That mark," he said. "We know that brand. It's Ansel's oven," a new edge cut through the air. Marta felt the third emotional shift. Cold suspicion coiled now into anger aimed at someone the village trusted. They did not go straight to accusation. Marta and Thomas carried the sacks to the chapel where Jacob had convened the watch. Ansel arrived, paint of flour still on his thumbs. He took the cloth from Marta like a man receiving news he hoped was false. "This is my stamp," he said, and the line in his voice broke into 2. Hurt and a defensive insistence. "I burn that every week." Someone could have used it. Jacob's face hardened. "Someone would have to take it from the oven workbench," he said. The chapel filled with the quick clatter of villagers' voices. Marta felt the crowd tilt toward rage. She moved between Ansel and the nearest man with clenched hands. The action calmed nothing but bought a breath of time. The confrontation outside the oven later that night took shape like a snap in the frozen air. Villagers pressed forward, torches casting long, harsh lines across the yard. Ansel's mouth worked. He repeated that he marked sacks, that he kept the token ledger. Thomas stepped forward and demanded, who else had access to the stamps? Who else could have used them? The questions came in short, quick bursts. Ansel's replies were short too. "Jacob knows the list. Marta knows the morning watch. I am the baker." Their voices rose and dropped with the rhythm of an argument that has no resolution until one side breaks. Several villagers began to shout. Marta put a palm flat on Ansel's shoulder and said, "Ansel, breathe. Tell us what you remember of last week." Her voice was steady. Her body took the risk of closeness. Ansel inhaled, then spoke in a string of clipped sentences. "Last week I left the stamps by the bench. I saw Thomas passing the yard. I closed the oven and went for water. When I returned, the bench was bare." He looked at Thomas as if the name itself was a question. Thomas answered quickly, 3 short lines. "I passed. I did not touch. I was fetching nets." "I have no reason." The exchange was fast, and the crowd snapped toward each name. Marta listened for cracks. Her eyes went to Ansel's hands. They were raw, the nails split from handling duff and ember. He did not look like a liar. Yet the stamped cloth had been used. Suspicion and the need to shield the village tightened Marta's decisions. Someone in the crowd said, "Search his cottage," and the words spread with the speed of a small blaze. The eldest among them, Jacob, rose and tried to put a boundary around the anger. "We will search fairly," he declared. "No one is judged without cause." But fear had already given permission to accusation. Ansel's face turned ashen. Marta watched him stand between the ovens and the lane, listening, hands open and empty. She felt a pulling inside her. This could become a rout. Her body reacted, immediate and physical. She stepped toward the crowd and said, "Not like this. We will take the sacks and count the stamps. We will not break a man's door down without proof," her voice carried. The crowd stilled enough for one more motion of reason. Thomas led a small group to the river cottage where the trail had pointed. Marta rode behind on quick feet. The path narrowed, the wind kicked up a biting skim of snow, and then they found the half-collapsed cottage beside the bank. Smoke curled from a low chimney, and a small child coughed inside. A desperate stranger lay against the wall with stolen sacks stacked beside him like a sorry defense. Marta's hands moved before her mouth. She checked the child's breathing, pressing a cloth to lips, noting the shallow lift of a rib cage. Thomas made a rough motion toward the stranger and spoke in a voice meant to cut. "Why here? Why take from your neighbors?" The stranger answered in a broken stream. "My wife is gone. I walked from the north road. The child couldn't feed. I tried to hide what I could carry." His words were quick, breathy, and they changed the atmosphere in a line. Anger loosened. Pity pushed in. Marta felt that shift in her chest, a sudden softening that pulled her to tend the child. At the cottage door Marta found the stamped cloth again, half hidden under straw. She lifted it and the brand burned in her memory. The same oven mark. She looked at Ansel in the doorway when they brought him there, and the man's face showed fatigue more than guilt. "I stamped those sacks last week, Ansel. I set them by the bench before prayer. I remember hearing voices near the oven, but I went for water." He touched his temple with flour-streaked fingers. Thomas's jaw tightened. Jacob watched both men with the slow gravity of a judge. Then Marta turned the cloth in her hands and noticed a faint second impression, a smear where the brand had been reheated and pressed into another cloth. The detail shifted everything for Marta. The theft had not been made by a stranger stealing a stamped sack, nor by an ill man taking out of hunger alone. Someone had taken a stamped impression and reused it. That small fact forced a new thought. Inside, complicity was possible, but not necessarily in the way they first assumed. Back at the oven yard, the next confrontation gathered force. Villagers pressed, voices bristling. Ansel braced himself as men spoke in quick clusters. "You used the stamps for your own sacks," one man accused. "You sold bread away from us," another said. The exchange became a rapid fire of 3 to 6 quick lines between Thomas and Ansel, Thomas repeating the same sharp questions, Ansel responding with short denials and a plea for patience. Marta stood in the middle and put her palms up to keep some order. She Ansel to show his ledger. He opened it with hands that trembled. Names were written in a cramped hand. Payments and markings did not line up with the stolen sacks. Jacob took the ledger, thumbed pages, and then raised his head. "We will not tear the man apart here, Jacob. We will set a watch. And we will count every stamped sack in the morning." The crowd hissed like a wound closing. Anger ebbed into a tense, watchful quiet. Marta felt exhausted and alert in the same breath. She had guided the village away from a riot, but the underlying suspicion remained. That night Marta walked home with a small cloth-wrapped piece of salvage for her family. The village was quieter, but torches burned at watch posts outside the ovens. She moved more carefully than usual on the iced path, boots making small, crisp sounds. Inside her cottage she set the bread on her table, and her child reached for the crust with bare fingers. Marta tore the loaf in half and the child ate with slow, grateful bites. The fourth emotional shift came. Anger and suspicion cooled into a careful, wary relief at the immediate safety of her family. She pressed a thumb to the iron key on its cord, then stepped to the window and looked toward the thawing stream. A thin sapling stood by the bank, a near, black tip of bud showing through the wet snow. It seemed absurd to search for hope in a single twig, but she felt something like that when she saw it, a small, stubborn sign that not everything was taken. Before she could settle, Lynn rapped at the door. "Marta, Jacob wants you at the chapel before dawn." Lynn in a low voice. Marta wrapped a cloak around her shoulders and followed. The elder's plan unfolded. Watch shifts, repair the oven door, and a public accounting of stamped sacks over each baker's bench. The compromise was practical and rough. Jacob handed tasks like pieces of wood for a fire. Ansel volunteered to mend the baking bench and help with the list. Thomas agreed to lead a watch with 2 others. Marta agreed to keep a ledger of the watch rotations. Each decision was a small governance of necessity rather than vindication. As the village dispersed, quiet resentments lingered in faces. In the pre-dawn hush, Marta returned to her cottage with a portion measured by desperation and a ledger entry in her head. She set the salvaged bread into a cupboard and closed the latch with the simple iron key that hung at her neck. The key's metal was cold and familiar against her palm. She crossed to the window and pressed her forehead against the glass just long enough to fog a small round. Outside, by the stream, the sapling's dark tip showed against the thawing bank. Marta watched it for a breath, then turned and said to herself, not aloud, but in action. She would wake early and stand the first watch beside Ansel tomorrow, not because she trusted him completely, but because the village needed a watch that would bring answers rather than knives. The night ended with a small, specific movement. Marta placed the ledger notes on the table beside the child's bowl and pushed the iron key into her apron pocket. The key slid cold and sure against her thigh. She took the bread back from the table, wrapped it in cloth, and left it on the sill for a neighbor who had a cough. The final image of the night was concrete and direct. She closed the cottage door, turned the key, and felt the wood settle against the frame. The village did not break. It had learned how to move from blind accusation to guarded accounting. Marta's decisions had made the space for that change, and the thin tip of green by the stream was a small detail she could point to when asked how the morning might hold. She set her hand on the door's iron ring and inhaled the faint scent of wood smoke and rising flour before the cold took her again. Marta's gloved hand caught on a strip of red wool snagged to the iron rail. She pulled and the child's scarf came free, damp with frost and smeared with a pale smear of flour. Suspicion tightened Marta's grip as she bent and read the fresh, mixed size footprints leading from the square toward the dark commons. The bell had just finished its slow ring. The village lay under dusk and a thin crust of new snow, where sled runners had cut a shallow furrow. She shoved the scarf into the inside of her cloak and listened, not for sound, but for the small, telling details. The creak of a sled runner, the distant cough of someone on the far lane, the pattern of broken twigs near the granary gate. The problem was plain within those first breaths. Food had been taken, and someone had hurried away, possibly injured. Marta tightened her shoulders and moved down from the platform, the word suspicion still burning like a stone in her hand, and shaping every choice she made. She crossed the tower stairs 2 at a time and met Thomas at the yard gate. He had already seen the torn strap and the flattened snow where a sled had been dragged. Thomas crouched and pressed his palm to a track. He frowned and said, "These are not our tokens." Marta looked at the small, mismatched coin tucked in the strap's fray. She knew the common marks, her own mother's token, the smith's mark, the miller's scratch. But this one bore a stamped crescent she had not seen in their village. "Marta, this does not belong here." Her voice was slow. The town smelled of wet wool and wood smoke. Her breath made a small cloud that dissolved over the rails. They followed the prince, moving past the half-empty granary where Marta had found the torn sacks before. The memory of that morning hung in her hands. The splintered latch, the damp footprint on the floor, the pale smear of snow in a flour sack. She did not speak the memory aloud. She showed it by touching the warped doorframe and rubbing away new frost along the sill. Thomas, Jacob is sharpening knives in the longhouse. He will be at the council. Marta felt the first shift of feeling, from suspicion to worry, as the tracks led toward the market road. She kept the scarf in her fist and felt the wool dampen against her palm. They found the hollow by the frozen market road where the sled lay half, buried beneath a drift. A child's mitten lay near the runners. The leather had been thumbed smooth. Marta crouched and lifted the mitten. Inside, she found a smear of soot and a scrap of browned crust the size of her thumb. Thomas touched the child's mitten and said, "Someone pulled hard here." Jacob came up behind them, his breath hard, and he said, sharply, "Who took from us? Who dares?" Thomas answered, "We do not know yet." The crowd's need for a clear enemy pushed the first emotion shift outward, toward anger. They found the woman tending a coughing child beside the sled. Her hair was wet with melted snow, and she wore a torn cloak wrapped tighter than her shoulders. Marta stepped forward and said, "Show us your hands." The woman lifted them slowly. One hand bore a shallow burn. The other had fingernails riddled with dirt. She pressed the child closer and said, "We had nowhere left. The village behind us burned when the wind turned. We walked for 2 nights. I took only enough so they would not die on the road." The woman's voice was small and direct. Her name, Marta learned, was Sign. The child's name was Lena. Jacob's jaw tightened. He spat, burned, or excuses. "We cannot feed strangers." Elder Anselm stepped forward. He held the longhouse lamp higher and said, "We must do what keeps the village whole." His voice carried the authority of many winters. Thomas remained silent for a moment, hands at his side. We should at least hear them." Marta felt the next emotion shift, the anger of the crowd pushing against a rising, complicated compassion inside her. She remembered the morning when sacks had been emptied and tokens scattered, and she connected the new discovery to the old thefts. The events were no longer isolated. They formed a line. The hollow smelled of wet leather and baking crust. Marta watched Sign straighten and touch the child's cheek. Lina wheezed. Each breath made a faint, whistling sound through her thin scarf. Marta stepped close enough to see the child's lips crack from cold. She did not ask more questions. She touched Lena's fingers, rubbed them between her own mittens, and felt immediate obligation in the action. "Thomas, if they truly escaped a burned village, why take from us?" Marta answered with something that sounded like steel and mercy in the same line. "Because hunger does not ask permission," the crowd muttered. Jacob gripped a walking staff. His knuckles whitened. They walked back toward the longhouse carrying what they could salvage. Someone had gathered bits of peat and kindling. Marta held the child's mitten in one pocket and the token in another. Elder Anselm called the council to order under the longhouse's low rafters. The lamp flame cast a nervous, steady light across faces. Jacob spoke first and pressed for strict measures. "We will ration every loaf and bind those who steal." "No mercy," Elder Anselm answered. "We must preserve what keeps our village alive." He looked at Marta and asked, "What do you say, Marta?" She breathed, tasting wood smoke and salt. The core feeling, suspicion, still guided her questions. She, aloud and steady, "Do we know these people?" The elders looked at one another. Marta argued with words and with the weight of her hands. She pointed to the token she had held from the strap and placed it on the table. "This mark is from the southern fields near the river bend. I saw it once when my sister bought seed. If they come from there, their road is long and broken." Anselm frowned. "Jacob, that is not our concern. We count by bread and by list." Thomas added, "Lists do not soften frozen fingers." The debate moved quickly into a clash of priorities. The crowd leaned in like a single animal deciding whether to strike. Marta felt her chest tighten. The next emotion shift arrived as tension eased toward resolve, when she recognized an obligation that could not be ignored. Late into the night, a small patrol followed the trail farther along the market road and found more signs. A child's shoe wedged behind a stone, a scrap of woven cloth with a faded border that matched Sinus' cloak. They also found an overturned pail near a midden and a bundle of tokens from other villages mixed in a small pile. Thomas brought back the news with his shoulders hunched. They were not lone thieves. They gathered whatever they could from shattered places and moved under cover of dark. Jacob's reply cut across the room, quick and sharp. Then they are thieves who will return. Anselm held up a hand and quieted the shouting. Marta watched faces one by one. She counted names in her mind. Jacob the storekeeper, blunt and fearful. Thomas the patrolman, steady and slow. Anselm, whose decisions had kept them whole these winters. Sine, who had smelled of smoke and carried a child. Their choices would shape the village for months. Marta rose and said, "We can set a temporary plan. We feed them tonight. At first light they move on. We watch the roads and send word to the neighboring hamlets." The room filled with immediate responses: dissent, relief, accusation. Jacob banged his staff and said, "You would give bread to strangers," Marta answered. "I would give bread to keep a child alive." Her voice did not plead. It named a fact. When the crowd moved toward the hollow, the anger resumed in close, volatile steps. Two men from Jacob's faction pushed forward, faces red and voices raised. Thomas placed himself near the torchlight and said, "Stand back, Jacob, bind them, return our goods." No exceptions. Marta stepped between the crowd and the sled. She felt the old fear of being alone in a decision, and she felt a harder resolve forming. Her hands slipped inside her cloak and found the loaf she had saved from the morning crust. It was the last full loaf she had. She had intended it for her own family, but she also knew what a child's fingers could do with a warm piece of bread. Jacob shoved a hand toward Sine. He barked, "Hands up and give us the goods." Sine stepped back and held Lena protectively. The child pressed her face into the woman's shoulder and let out a small, ragged whimper. Marta felt her body move before her thought finished. She stripped her cloak free, folds of patched wool falling to her knees, and exposed the loaf beneath. The motion startled the crowd into silence. Marta lifted the bread with both hands and broke it in two with a quick, clean motion. She stepped forward and said simply, "Lina." She handed half to the child with her fingers set solidly under the crust, so no one could accuse her of waste. A beat of silence followed. Anselm's eyes narrowed and he said, "Marta." Thomas' mouth pressed into a thin line. Jacob spat and said, "You give our last to strangers and expect no reckoning." Marta answered, in a voice that was both low and clear, "I will stand between them and the village tonight. If you wish to punish, you will have to punish me first." The crowd shifted. Voices rose again in a quick volley. "Jacob, they steal." Marta. "They are not thieves by choice." Thomas. "We can bind and question." Marta. "Bind me if you must." Anselm. "We cannot fracture now. We must be measured." Jacob. "Measured keeps children thin." Those lines came fast. Each name marked who spoke. The exchange contained 3 short rounds of back and forth as the requirements for argument demanded. The crowd pressed in like an audience waiting for the elder to settle the question. Anselm's hand lifted, slow and deliberate. He looked at Marta, then at the child with crust in her small hands. For a long moment he said nothing. Finally Anselm spoke. We spare them tonight. They are to sleep under watch and leave with first light. We ration tightly from tomorrow. If they attempt anything beyond this mercy, our laws will follow." Jacob hissed. "They will not go quietly." Thomas tightened his jaw and looked at Marta. She kept her hands open and still. The immediate danger broke into a brittle compromise. The villagers began to move, not with cheer, but with the slow, functional motions of people returning to hard work. The crowd dispersed in fragments, each going toward a task that would make the council's promise real. That night Marta sat near the communal oven, Lena asleep with the offered half loaf warming in her belly. The oven's heat hit Marta's face in a way that felt like a small, private sun. Thomas lingered by the doorway, boots wet from the road. He did not speak at first. He watched while Marta tended the embers with a practiced hand. The next emotion shift moved inward, from public argument to private unease. It threaded through Thomas' quiet and Marta's steady motion. Thomas finally said, "You risked a lot, Marta," she answered, cleaning crumbs into a palm. "I risked my place at the council table tonight." He gave a short, humorless laugh and said, "You gave more than a place." Jacob will not forget Marta's hands shook once when she put the loaf's heel into the child's mouth. She caught her own reflection in the iron and saw the steady lines at the eyes deepen. At dawn, Marta rose with Lina and walked the lane with Thomas. They watched the pale edge of a weak sun touching the highest roofs. The outsiders prepared to leave, blankets rolled, a small bundle of recovercons clutched by Sign. Before she went, Sign took Marta's hand. "You do not know how to say thank you in my tongue, but you gave us air to find our feet." Marta nodded and said, "Go while you may. Find shelter where others left one." Sign lifted Lina and kissed the child's forehead. As the small group departed, a young patrolman handed Marta a scrap of stamped leather. It matched the token she had pocketed. She pressed it to her palm and recognized the pattern from fields beyond the river bend, the same mark she had seen once on a bag seller's cart. The token meant more than a direction. It suggested that whole stretches of countryside were unraveling: fires, movement, stolen goods, displaced families. The winter's trouble extended beyond the lanes of their village. Thomas watched the little party fade into the grey light. "We will send word downriver," Marta nodded. She felt tired then, not from standing, but from having to decide between two kinds of harm. The council's compromise had held for a night, but it had not fixed the deeper dislocation. Marta unwrapped the small leather scrap and slipped it into her palm. She heard the oven's dying breath in the hearth and the quiet scrape of a cart wheel somewhere far off. At home, Marta tended the embers while Lina slept in a corner wrapped in a spare blanket. She set the small iron key on the table and, from the sled bundle, took a token that matched the mark she remembered. She placed it next to the keys and then closed the coffer lid with a deliberate hand. The action was concrete and small. She had examined the token, recognized the mark, and chosen to keep it safe for later inquiry. That choice would shape the coming days. It bound her to a duty beyond feeding one child. Jacob came by later, his face not yet warm from sleep. He avoided Marta's eyes and said, "We will tighten the list." Marta answered, "Do it with watchful care, not with blind hunger." He grunted and left. Thomas paused at the doorway and said, "If you need me, I will ride to the south." Marta shook her head. "Not yet. The roads are thin with ice. We need more to move." She set the token into a small drawer and closed it. The drawer's sound was ordinary, but the movement tied her hands to a responsibility. To watch, to record, and to act when the pattern of tokens showed a truth. By midday, the village resumed its chores under a sky the color of old pewter. People rationed quietly. Some offered scraps to the newcomers, others measured flour into strict portions. Marta moved through these tasks with attention, handing peat to those who collected by the ovens, mending a torn strap for a sled, adjusting the long rope on the bell that had already signaled this night's trouble. Each action was a small anchor, a practical stitch in the thin fabric that held the village together. Late afternoon brought a new stir. A messenger arrived with news. A neighboring hamlet had sighted smoke on the far ridge and counted new tracks heading west. The messenger said simply, "It is not only they. It is spreading." Jacob slammed his palm on the bench and said, "Then we must ration deeper." Anselm answered, "We must open a watch and send word to our neighbors. We cannot make harsh finalities now." Thomas turned to Marta and said, "You were right to keep that token. It may lead to where this began." Marta folded her hands and felt the steady, exhausted relief of a plan forming from small observations. That evening, Marta sat near her own hearth with Lena asleep beside, heard the child's breath even and shallow. She took the small token from the drawer and turned it in her fingers. She thought of the counsel, of Anselm's reluctant voice, of Thomas' steady presence, of Jacob's anger, and of Sign's tired hands. She felt the last shift of feeling in the chapter, from immediate suspicion to a sober acceptance of duty and a quiet knowledge that mercy had consequences. She did not make any grand promises. Instead, she prepared a list of small actions. Send word to the river hamlets, mend sled runners for quick patrol, ask the miller to keep an eye on shipments. Each item was concrete. Each item could slow the unraveling if enough hands did them. As the night closed, Marta placed the token beneath the coffer lid and set the rosary on top. Lina stirred and reached for a loose crust, smiling in sleep. Marta covered the child more tightly and stood. She listened to the longhouse clock tick, and then heard the faint creak of the bell platform above, still steady from the night's watch. Marta walked there, scarf looped around her neck, and looked out over the village lanes. She could see the pale smudge where the sled had been left, a marker of a night's decisions. She breathed in, and the air tasted of ash and peat and of something else, a fragile hope linked to concrete actions rather than words. Marta turned and walked back down the stairs. She closed the coffer and put the iron key on its cord. The final line of the chapter is a simple, tangible beat. Marta tucks the leather token under the rosary and locks the coffer, the metal lid clicking once as the dawn's first thin light slips through the window.